The crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed through the dusty barn like a gunshot, and 23-year-old Cordelia Whitmore felt her heart shatter with it. The magnificent stallion reared on his hind legs, his coal-black coat gleaming with sweat and fury, eyes rolling white with terror as two ranch hands struggled to control the lead rope. "This one's beyond hope, folks," bellowed Jasper Hawthorne, the auctioneer, his weathered face grim beneath his worn Stetson, mean as a rattlesnake, and twice as dangerous. Been through 4 trainers, and not one could break him. Starting bid is $50, and I'll be honest, you'd be buying yourself a one-way ticket to the glue factory. The crowd of ranchers and horse traders shifted uncomfortably, boots scraping against the wooden floor. Cordelia pressed closer to the auction ring, her calloused hands gripping the metal railing until her knuckles went white. The horse they called him Tempest stood, nearly 17 hands high, a creature of pure wilderness that seemed to embody every storm that had ever raged across the Montana plains. Behind her, she could hear her father's heavy footsteps approaching. Finnegan Whitmore was a practical man who'd spent 40 years working their struggling ranch, and she knew exactly what he'd say about her foolish interest in the untamable stallion. "Cordelia, we came here for breeding stock, not pipe dreams." Finnegan's voice rumbled in her ear, but she barely heard him. Something extraordinary was happening in the ring. Tempest had stopped fighting. His massive head turned toward her, and those wild dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The ranch hands loosened their grip on the rope, confused by the sudden stillness, but Cordelia understood. In that moment of connection, she saw past the fear and rage to something deeper, spirit that recognized a kindred soul. Going once. "For $50, Hawthorne called out, scanning the silent crowd. "This beast will likely kill whoever's fool enough to take him home." Cordelia's hand shot up before she could stop herself. $50. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Her father's strong hand clamped down on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off, stepping forward. Tempest's ears pricked forward, and incredibly, he took a step toward her, his hooves clattering against the wooden floor of the ring. "Miss, I strongly advise against this purchase," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying genuine concern. "This animal is dangerous. He's already sent 2 men to the hospital, and $60, Cordelia called out, her voice stronger now. She could feel the crowd's amazement as Tempest continued moving toward her. The lead rope now slack in the handler's bewildered grasp. The stallion stopped just inches from the railing where she stood, his great head lowered, and she found herself staring into eyes that held the wisdom of ages and the pain of countless betrayals. Without thinking, she reached out her hand, palm up, and held it steady despite the trembling in her arms. The entire barn fell silent. Even Hawthorne stopped his auctioneering patter, watching in stunned disbelief as the hopeless horse gently pressed his velvet muzzle against Cordelia's palm. The touch was electric, a connection that transcended words or training or the brutal realities of breaking wild things. "Well, I'll be damned," someone whispered from the crowd. "Sold," Hawthorne said quietly, his gavel falling with surprising gentleness. To the young lady with the magic touch, the loading of Tempest into the horse trailer should have been a nightmare. 3 grown men with cattle prods and ropes stood ready for battle, but Cordelia simply walked to the trailer's ramp and called his name. The great stallion followed her like a loyal dog, his hooves echoing against the metal flooring as he settled into the confines of the trailer, without so much as a snort of protest. Finnegan Whitmore shook his head in disbelief as he climbed into the driver's seat of their battered Ford pickup. "In 40 years of ranching, I've never seen anything like that," he muttered, adjusting his rearview mirror to watch the trailer. "That horse has been a terror for months, and he follows you like you're his long-lost mother." Cordelia sat in the passenger seat, her heart still racing from the encounter at the auction. Through the truck's rear window, she could see Tempest's dark silhouette in the trailer, and she swore she could feel his presence like a warm current running between them. Maybe he just needed someone to see him for who he really is, instead of what everyone expected him to be. The 30-mile journey back to the Whitmore ranch passed in relative quiet, broken only by the rumble of the truck's engine and the occasional creak of the trailer. But as they turned into their gravel driveway, trouble announced itself with the sharp crack of splintering wood. Tempest was kicking hard. Finnegan slammed on the brakes and they both jumped out. But before either could reach the trailer, the back gate exploded outward in a shower of twisted metal and wood splinters. The stallion burst free like a black lightning bolt, his powerful legs carrying him across their pasture at a full gallop. "There goes $500, Finnegan said grimly. But Cordelia was already running. She vaulted over the pasture fence with the agility of someone who'd grown up on horseback, her boots pounding against the hard-packed earth as she pursued. The fleeing stallion. Tempest had reached the far end of their property, where the fence line met the edge of Broken Creek, and he was pacing back and forth like a caged tiger. "Easy, boy," Cordelia called out, slowing her approach to a walk. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The horse spun to face her, his sides heaving with exertion and emotion. For a moment, she thought he might bolt again, leap the fence, and disappear into the wild country beyond their ranch. But instead, he stood his ground, watching her with those intelligent dark eyes. She stopped 20 feet away and slowly sank to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the grass. "I know you're scared," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what it feels like to have everyone tell you what you can't do, what you'll never be. But you're home now, Tempest. This is your home." The wind rustled through the cottonwoods along the creek, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. Tempest's ears swiveled toward the sound, then back to her. Slowly, cautiously, he began to walk in her direction. When he reached her, he lowered his great head until his muzzle was inches from her face. She could feel his warm breath on her cheek, could see her reflection in his dark eyes. Without breaking eye contact, she reached up and gently touched his neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath his silky coat. "You're going to be magnificent," she whispered. "But first, you're going to be free." From the fence line, Finnegan watched his daughter and the hopeless horse, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in something beyond the harsh realities of drought and debt and the daily struggle to keep their ranch alive. 2 weeks passed, and Tempest had transformed their small ranch into something resembling a battlefield. He'd kicked down 3 fence posts, destroyed the grain storage shed, and sent their hired hand, Boone Garrett, scrambling up a hay bale stack to escape his thundering hooves. Yet every evening, without fail, the stallion would appear at the pasture gate, where Cordelia waited with an apple and gentle words. "That horse is going to kill someone," Boone declared on a particularly rough morning, nursing a bruised shoulder where Tempest had shouldered him aside. "He's calm as a lamb with Miss Cordelia, but the rest of us might as well be wearing target signs." Finnegan nodded grimly from his position on the porch, where he was tallying the mounting repair costs in his ledger. The ranch was barely breaking, even as it was, and Tempest's destructive presence was pushing them toward financial ruin. Maybe it's time to call Jasper Hawthorne, see if he'll take the horse back. No, Cordelia's voice carried a steel that reminded Finnegan of her late mother. She stood in the doorway, her dark hair braided back and her work clothes dusty from the morning chores. Tempest isn't the problem, we are. She stepped off the porch and walked toward the pasture where the stallion grazed, seemingly peaceful in the morning sun, but Finnegan knew better. He'd seen the way Tempest's head came up whenever a stranger appeared, the way his muscles coiled with barely contained energy. We've been trying to make him fit into our world, Cordelia continued, reaching the fence line. But what if we tried to understand his world instead? As if summoned by her words, Tempest lifted his head and trotted over, his gait flowing and graceful. He thrust his nose through the fence rails, and Cordelia reached out to stroke his face with the familiarity of long friendship. "Show me," she whispered to the horse. "Show me what you need." What happened next defied everything Finnegan thought he knew about horses and human nature. Tempest backed away from the fence, then began to move in a wide circle round the pasture. His movements weren't random, they were deliberate, purposeful, like a dance choreographed by instinct and intelligence. Cordelia watched for several minutes, then slowly climbed over the fence. Boone started forward with a warning shout, but Finnegan held up a hand to stop him. They watched in fascination as Cordelia began to mirror Tempest's movements, circling in the opposite direction, matching his pace and rhythm. The dance continued for nearly an hour. Sometimes Tempest would stop and Cordelia would stop. Sometimes he would change direction and she would follow. Gradually, their circles grew smaller, bringing them closer together, until finally they were moving side by side in perfect synchronization. "He's teaching her," Finnegan breathed, understanding flooding through him. "He's teaching her his language." The lesson ended when Tempest simply stopped and lowered his head to graze, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Cordelia remained beside him, her hand resting on his withers, both of them breathing hard from the exertion. That afternoon, something miraculous occurred. When Boone approached the pasture carrying a bucket of oats, Tempest didn't charge or threaten. Instead, he looked to Cordelia, who nodded encouragingly, and then allowed the hired hand to pour the grain into the feeding trough without incident. "Well, I'll be," Boone muttered, scratching his head. "It's like she's translating for him." Over the following days, the pattern repeated itself. Cordelia would spend time with Tempest, communicating in their wordless language of movement and trust, and gradually the stallion began to accept the presence of others on the ranch. He was still wary, still ready to defend himself if threatened, but the blind rage had been replaced by watchful intelligence. Neighbors began to take notice. Word spread through the valley about the Whitmore girl who could speak to the untamable horse, and visitors started appearing at their gate, curious to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Among them was Dr. Octavia Marsh, a veterinarian and horse behaviorist from the State University, who arrived one morning with a truck full of recording equipment and scientific skepticism. She left 3 hours later, her skepticism transformed into wonder, and her equipment forgotten in favor of furious note-taking about the remarkable bond she'd witnessed between girl and horse. News of Cordelia and Tempest spread beyond the valley like wildfire, eventually reaching the ears of Calhoun Briggs, the most successful horse trainer in 3 states. Briggs owned a sprawling operation called Thunder Ridge Ranch, where he specialized in turning wild horses into championship competitors for wealthy clients. His methods were harsh but effective, and his reputation was built on the philosophy that any horse could be broken if you applied the right amount of pressure. When Briggs rolled up to the Whitmore ranch in his gleaming silver truck and custom horse trailer, Finnegan knew they were in for trouble. The man who climbed out was tall and lean, with cold blue eyes and the kind of confidence that came from never having met a challenge he couldn't dominate. "Heard you folks have been playing games with that black stallion," Briggs said without preamble, his gaze sweeping dismissively over their modest ranch buildings. "I'm here to make you an offer that'll solve all your problems." Cordelia emerged from the barn where she'd been grooming Tempest, and Finnegan saw the stallion's head appear over the stall door. His ears pricked forward with interest at the stranger's voice. "We're not interested in selling," Cordelia said firmly, but Briggs just smiled. $5,000, he said, pulling out a checkbook. "Cash money, right here and now. More than that horse will ever be worth to you." The offer hit Finnegan like a physical blow. $5,000 would pay off their bank loan and give them enough operating capital to survive another year of drought. It was more money than they'd see in months of struggling to make ends meet. "He's not for sale," Cordelia repeated, but her voice was less certain now, and Finnegan saw her glance toward him with worry in her eyes. Briggs noticed the exchange too, and his smile widened. "I'll tell you what," he said, clearly enjoying the moment. "Let's make this interesting. Give me 30 minutes with that horse, and if I can ride him, you sell him to me for $5,000. If I can't, I'll pay you $1,000 just for the entertainment." "Absolutely not," Cordelia said, but Briggs held up a hand. "I'm not talking about breaking him with whips and spurs," he said smoothly. "Just good old-fashioned horse training. If your bond with him is as special as everyone claims, he won't let me on his back regardless of what I do. You've got nothing to lose and everything to gain." The challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud. Finnegan found himself torn between his daughter's obvious distress and the desperate reality of their financial situation. $1,000 for 30 minutes would buy them feed for the winter. 5,000 would save the ranch. "What do you say, girl?" Briggs pressed, confident enough in your horse whispering to put it to the test. Before Cordelia could respond, a thunderous crash echoed from the barn. Tempest had kicked his stall door so hard that the heavy wood had splintered. The stallion burst into the yard, his eyes fixed on Briggs with unmistakable hostility. Briggs took an involuntary step backward, his confidence flickering for the first time. "Well," he said, recovering quickly. "Looks like he's eager to get started." Cordelia moved to Tempest's side, her hand finding the familiar spot on his neck where she could feel his pulse racing with anger. The stallion was reading the tension in the air, sensing the threat that Briggs represented to their bond. "One condition," she said finally, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "If you can't ride him, you leave and never come back. No more offers, no more challenges." Briggs nodded, already reaching for the lead rope hanging on his belt. "Deal. But when I'm riding that horse, you remember that pride doesn't pay the bills." As he approached Tempest, Cordelia felt a chill run down her spine. She'd made a terrible mistake, but it was too late to back down now. The next 30 minutes would determine not just Tempest's fate, but the future of everything she'd built with the magnificent stallion who'd followed her home from that auction ring. Calhoun Briggs approached Tempest with the calculated confidence of a man who'd never met a horse he couldn't dominate. He carried his lead rope loosely, his movements fluid and non-threatening. Every gesture designed to project calm authority, but Tempest wasn't fooled. The stallion's nostrils flared as he caught Briggs' scent, and his muscles tensed like coiled springs. Cordelia remained at his side, her hand still resting on his neck, feeling the rapid drumbeat of his heart beneath her palm. "Easy there, big fellow," Briggs crooned, his voice smooth as honey. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Just want to get acquainted." For the first 10 minutes, Briggs was the picture of patience. He allowed Tempest to sniff him, offered treats from his pocket, and spoke in soothing tones while gradually working the lead rope around the stallion's neck. Cordelia watched with growing dread as Tempest seemed to accept the trainer's presence, even allowing him to stroke his powerful shoulder. "See," Briggs called out to the small crowd that had gathered. "It's all about reading their body language, establishing dominance through calm persistence." But Cordelia knew Tempest better than anyone, and she could see the signs that Briggs was missing. The stallion's ears weren't truly relaxed, they swiveled constantly, tracking every sound and movement. His tail swished in short, sharp strokes. That spoke of barely contained tension. He was tolerating Briggs, not accepting him. At the 15-minute mark, Briggs made his move. With practiced efficiency, he slipped a bridle over Tempest's head and cinched a saddle onto his back. The stallion stood perfectly still through it all, and Cordelia's heart sank. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe Tempest really would accept any strong-willed trainer. But when Briggs put his foot in the stirrup and began to swing his leg over Tempest's back, everything changed in an instant. The explosion of motion was breathtaking. Tempest transformed from a statue into a tornado of black fury, launching himself skyward with such violence that Briggs was airborne before his brain could process what was happening. The trainer hit the ground hard, rolled twice, and came up, gasping for breath as Tempest bucked and spun in a display of raw power that had the spectators scrambling for safety. 30 seconds. Someone shouted. He lasted 30 seconds, but Briggs wasn't finished. As Tempest's bucking subsided, the trainer climbed to his feet, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. From his truck, he retrieved a long training whip and a set of spurs that glinted wickedly in the afternoon sun. "Time's not up yet," he snarled, advancing on the stallion. "Let's see how long your precious bond lasts when reality comes calling." "That wasn't part of the deal," Cordelia protested, but Briggs ignored her. The whip cracked through the air, and Tempest reared, his hooves slashing at the sky. But instead of backing down, Briggs pressed his attack, using the whip and spurs to drive the stallion into a corner of the corral where he'd have less room to maneuver. For 5 terrible minutes, the battle raged. Briggs was skilled with his tools of dominance, keeping just out of range of Tempest's hooves, while applying relentless pressure. The stallion fought with the courage of the wild, but Cordelia could see him beginning to tire, could see the moment approaching when exhaustion would make him vulnerable. That's when she made a decision that would haunt her dreams for years too. "Come, Tempest," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Come to me." Both horse and trainer froze at her words. Tempest's sides were heaving with exertion, sweat darkening his coat, but his eyes found hers across the corral. In that moment of connection, Cordelia saw something that broke her heart: confusion, betrayal, and the terrible understanding that she had allowed this to happen. Slowly, painfully, Tempest began to walk toward her. Not the proud, powerful stride she was used to, but the careful gait of a creature whose spirit had been wounded. Briggs lowered his whip, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Looks like 30 minutes is up," he said, pulling out his checkbook. "I'll take that 5,000 now." But as he reached for Tempest's bridle, the stallion did something unexpected. He stepped past Cordelia, past the fence, and began walking toward the gate that led to the open range beyond their property. He moved with dignity and purpose, his head held high despite his exhaustion. "Where's he going?" Briggs demanded. Cordelia felt tears streaming down her face as understanding dawned. "He's leaving," she whispered. "He's choosing freedom over both of us." The gate to the open range stood 15 feet away, and with each step Tempest took toward it, Cordelia felt another piece of her heart break away. The stallion moved with the quiet dignity of a king going into exile, his decision made not in anger but in the kind of profound disappointment that cuts deeper than any wound. "Stop him," Briggs shouted, scrambling toward his truck where he kept a rifle for dealing with difficult horses. The animal's worth $5,000. But Finnegan Whitmore stepped into his path, and despite being 20 years older and 50 pounds lighter, there was something in the rancher's weathered face that made Briggs think twice about pushing past him. "The deal was 30 minutes, Finnegan said quietly. "Time's up, and you didn't ride him. Matter of fact, from where I was standing, looked like he dumped you faster than a bad habit." The growing crowd of neighbors and ranch hands murmured their agreement, and Briggs found himself outnumbered by people who'd witnessed his failure. But Cordelia barely heard the confrontation. Her entire focus was on Tempest, who had stopped just 3 feet from the gate, his head turned back toward her in his dark eyes. She saw the question he couldn't ask in words. "Why did you let him hurt me?" The weight of her betrayal crashed over her like a flood. She'd been so worried about money, so afraid of losing the ranch, that she'd forgotten the most important lesson Tempest had taught her, that trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired. "I'm sorry," she whispered, taking a step toward him. "I'm so sorry, boy. I should have protected you." Tempest stood perfectly still as she approached, but she could feel the distance between them that hadn't existed before. When she reached out to touch his neck, he didn't move away, but neither did he lean into her touch the way he always had. "I know you don't trust me anymore," she said, her voice breaking, "and I don't blame you. But before you go, I need you to know something." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled papers. She'd been carrying for weeks the bank notices and overdue bills that had driven her to accept Briggs' challenge. Without ceremony, she tore them in half and let the pieces scatter. "On the wind, I don't care about the money," she said. "I don't care about saving the ranch or proving anything to anyone. All I care about is you, and if you want to leave, then that's what you should do. You deserve to be free, Tempest. You always did." Behind her, she heard Briggs curse and storm back to his truck, his dreams of easy money evaporating like morning mist. The crowd began to disperse, sensing that the real drama was playing out in the quiet space between a girl and her horse. Tempest stood motionless for a long moment, his intelligent eyes studying her face. Then, slowly, he began to move, but instead of heading for the gate, he turned and walked back toward her. When he reached her side, he lowered his great head and rested his muzzle against her shoulder in a gesture of forgiveness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Does this mean you'll stay?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. His answer came in the form of a gentle nicker, and suddenly he was her Tempest again, proud and powerful, but choosing to share his strength with someone who'd proven worthy of his trust. 6 months later, Cordelia sat on the porch of their newly renovated ranch house, watching Tempest graze in the pasture with a small herd of rescued horses they'd taken in. The money had come from an unexpected source. Dr. Octavia Marsh had written a book about their story, and the royalties had been enough to pay off their debts and turn the Whitmore Ranch into a sanctuary for horses that others had deemed hopeless. Visitors came from around the world to witness the bond between Cordelia and Tempest, and many left with a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly communicate with another living being. The stallion had never worn a saddle again, but he and Cordelia moved together as if they shared the same spirit, racing across the Montana plains in a partnership built on mutual respect and perfect trust. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tempest lifted his head from his grazing and looked toward the porch where Cordelia sat. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment of connection, both remembered the day when everyone else had called him hopeless. Everyone except the farmer's daughter who'd seen past his wildness to the magnificent heart that beat beneath. The auctioneer had been wrong. Tempest wasn't hopeless at all. He was exactly what he'd always been, free, proud, and perfect in his own untamed way. And in choosing to stay with Cordelia, he'd proven that the strongest bonds aren't forged with ropes and saddles, but with understanding, respect, and the kind of love that sets the heart free to choose its own destiny.